pressed into wet clay nearly 5,000 years ago, the words still wait. Cuneiform wedges spelling out names that thunder across millennia: Anunnaki, Enlil, Enki, Tiamat. These weren't bedtime stories for ancient children. They were official records, temple archives, royal chronicles describing a war among gods that ended the world as it was and began the world we inherited. Welcome. It's late, I know. Maybe you're settling in after a long day, or perhaps sleep has been elusive and you're looking for something to quiet the mind. Thank you for being here. What we're about to explore together sits at one of the strangest intersections in human knowledge, where ancient mythology meets archaeological evidence, where scholarly consensus encounters passionate alternative interpretation, and where the world's oldest written stories ask questions we still can't fully answer. Here's what makes this remarkable. In the 1850s, archaeologists began unearthing libraries beneath Iraqi sand, clay tablets by the thousands, and when scholars finally cracked the cuneiform code, they found detailed accounts of divine beings called the Anunnaki, who came to Earth, established civilization, fought catastrophic wars among themselves, and witnessed a great flood that nearly erased humanity. Mainstream archaeologists and Assyriologists see these as sophisticated mythology, creation stories that reveal how Sumerians understood cosmic order, human purpose, and the relationship between mortal and divine. In the 1970s, researcher Zecharia Sitchin proposed something different, that these texts preserved actual historical memory of extraterrestrial visitors, that the Anunnaki were flesh and blood beings from another world, and that human civilization emerged from their genetic engineering and technological intervention. The academic establishment largely rejected this interpretation, pointing to linguistic errors and archaeological inconsistencies in Sitchin's work. Yet his book sold millions of copies and sparked a movement that continues today, asking whether ancient people might have been describing real events in the only vocabulary they possessed. We're not here to settle that debate tonight. The purpose of these hours together isn't to prove or disprove, to validate or dismiss. We're here to explore what these ancient voices actually said, to understand the world that produced these extraordinary texts, and to sit with the mystery that has captivated human imagination for nearly 2 centuries since these tablets first emerged from the earth. Whether you see these as metaphor or memory, as mythology or history, the words themselves deserve patient attention. Take a breath. Where are you right now? Maybe in bed with the lights low, or perhaps in a chair with the house finally quiet around you. Let your shoulders drop just a bit. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to solve. We're just going to listen to what the oldest written stories have to say. Before we begin, if you find value in this kind of deep exploration, a like or subscribe helps others discover these journeys into ancient mystery. It's a small thing, but it matters. Thank you. Now then, picture a landscape 7,000 years ago, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved green corridors through an otherwise brutal desert. The air would have tasted different then, carried different moisture, moved across marshlands that stretched for miles between the rivers. No cities yet rose above the horizon, no temples, no ziggurats casting shadows across plazas where priests chanted to the morning star. But something was stirring in those fertile valleys, some human impulse toward permanence, toward record-keeping, toward capturing in clay what had always dissolved into air and memory. When writing finally emerged from those river valleys around 3200 BCE, humanity began to preserve its stories, and among the very first things written down were accounts of the gods, the Anunnaki, and the ages before the flood, when divine and human worlds intertwined in ways we're still trying to comprehend. The night is long ahead of us, and we have much ground to cover. Let's begin at the very beginning, in the land between 2 rivers, where civilization and writing and the stories of the gods all emerged together from the same ancient soil. 7,000 years ago, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates looked nothing like the Iraq we know today. Marshlands stretched for hundreds of kilometers, creating a wetland ecosystem so vast that boats became more practical than wagons for moving between settlements. Reed beds taller than a person swayed in perpetual wind, and the air hung thick with moisture even during summer months when temperatures climbed past 45 degrees Celsius. This was the late Ubaid period, roughly 5,500 to 4,000 BCE, and something extraordinary was beginning to happen in these river valleys. The rivers themselves moved differently then. Both the Tigris and Euphrates followed channels that have since shifted, depositing silt at a rate of approximately 3 centimeters per century along certain stretches of their floodplains. When the snowmelt came down from the Zagros Mountains each spring, the rivers could rise 4 to 6 meters above their dry season levels, transforming the landscape into temporary lakes that left behind nutrient-rich mud when they receded. Early inhabitants learned to work with these cycles rather than against them. developing irrigation techniques that would eventually support the world's first cities. Picture standing on a low mound in this landscape around 5000 BCE. The horizon would have appeared perfectly flat in every direction, broken only by the green lines marking watercourses and the darker clusters of date palms growing near permanent water sources. At night, with no light pollution for thousands of kilometers, the Milky Way would have painted the sky in such detail that individual nebulas appeared as distinct patches of luminosity. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns. These people were just beginning to track, to name, to incorporate into their understanding of when to plant and when to harvest. Archaeological evidence from sites like Eridu and Uruk reveals that humans had been living in this region for millennia before writing appeared. The Ubaid culture developed sophisticated ceramic traditions, creating pottery with geometric patterns that remained consistent across hundreds of kilometers, suggesting shared cultural practices or perhaps trade networks more extensive than previously imagined. These weren't primitive people scratching out mere survival, they were building temple complexes, organizing labor for large construction projects, and developing social hierarchies that would eventually become the foundation for city-states. Climate data extracted from sediment cores tells us the region experienced slightly higher rainfall during this period compared to today, perhaps 200 to 250 millimeters annually, rather than the current 150 millimeters. That difference might sound trivial, but it meant grasslands where there's now only desert, wildlife populations that could support larger human communities, and agricultural possibilities that have since vanished. The Persian Gulf coastline sat roughly 150 kilometers further south than its current position, having risen gradually since the end of the last ice age around 10,000 BCE. What were these early inhabitants thinking about? What stories did they tell before writing froze those stories into permanence? We can only guess based on what came later, but it seems they were already developing complex cosmologies, already imagining divine forces that controlled the floods and storms, and the mysterious emergence of life from the fertile mud. Small temple structures from this period show consistent orientation patterns, suggesting astronomical observation played a role in religious practice. These buildings weren't grand, most measured less than 10 meters on a side, constructed from mud brick that has since dissolved back into the earth from which it came. The transition from the Ubaid to the Uruk period around 4000 BCE marked an acceleration. Settlements grew larger, architectural ambitions expanded, and the organization required to manage irrigation systems became more sophisticated. Population estimates for Uruk itself suggest it reached 40,000 inhabitants by 3100 BCE, making it by far the largest human settlement on Earth at that time. Feeding that many people required coordination, planning, and record-keeping on a scale never before attempted, and that's where writing enters the story. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets date to approximately 3200 BCE, and they're gloriously mundane, tallies of grain, records of livestock, administrative documents tracking temple resources. Clay tokens had been used for accounting purposes for centuries before this, but someone made the leap to pressing those tokens into soft clay tablets, creating permanent impressions that could be stored, referenced, and transmitted. Within a few generations, the system evolved to represent not just quantities, but specific words, then concepts, then eventually the full range of human language including narrative, poetry, and theology. The world was about to acquire memory, permanent, tangible, recoverable memory that could survive across millennia, and among the very first things people chose to record, once they possessed the technology to do so, were stories about the gods, the Anunnaki, and the distant ages when divine beings walked among humanity and shaped the world according to their will. The invention of writing wasn't a single moment of inspiration. It emerged gradually, reluctantly almost, from the practical needs of temple administrators who required better methods for tracking increasingly complex economic activities. Around 3200 BCE in Uruk, someone pressed a pointed reed into wet clay at an angle, creating a wedge-shaped impression, then another wedge, and another. The shapes could be combined in different configurations to represent different concepts, and crucially, the tablets could be baked hard or simply left to dry in the intense Mesopotamian sun, preserving them indefinitely. Those first tablets from Uruk tell us nothing about gods or cosmic battles. They record quantities of barley, head counts of sheep, allocations of beer rations to workers. One tablet meticulously lists 27 jars of oil delivered to a specific temple storehouse. Another tracks the distribution of grain across 7 different administrative units. These weren't literature, they were spreadsheets, accounting ledgers capturing the unglamorous machinery that kept temple economies functioning. But the technology existed now, and within 3 centuries it would evolve to capture much more than numbers. By 2900 BCE, Cuneiform had developed sufficiently to represent not just quantities and objects, but complete sentences, names, and eventually complex narratives. The script used approximately 900 distinct signs during its early stages, though this would later be streamlined to around 600 core characters as scribes standardized the system. Each sign could represent a word, a syllable, or a semantic determinant that clarified meaning, making Sumerian cuneiform one of the most flexible but also most challenging writing systems ever developed. Learning to write required years of training, creating a professional scribal class whose skills were highly valued. The earliest god lists appear around 2600 BCE during what scholars call the early dynastic period. These are exactly what they sound like, systematic catalogues listing divine names in hierarchical order, establishing relationships between deities and mapping the cosmic bureaucracy that Sumerians believed governed reality. An, the sky god, typically appears at the top of these lists. Enlil, lord of the storm and wind, commands a high position. Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, occupies his own critical role, and beneath these primary deities, the lists name dozens of lesser gods, including the Anunnaki. Standing in the temple precincts at Nippur, around 2500 BCE, you would have encountered scribes at work. The sound alone would have been distinctive, the soft pressure of stylus against clay, the scraping as mistakes were smoothed over with wet fingers, the occasional snap when a tablet broke before completion. These scribes wore simple linen kilts during summer months, when temperatures inside the thick-walled scriptorium still reached 35 degrees Celsius despite the shade. They sat cross-legged on reed mats, tablets resting on their laps or on low brick platforms, working through lists and records that documented every aspect of temple operation. Some of these scribes were copying older texts. This is how knowledge propagated in the ancient world, through manual reproduction, each scribe creating their own version of canonical works, introducing slight variations that would eventually branch into different textual traditions. Among the texts being copied were creation stories, accounts of the primordial past, and descriptions of how the gods established order from chaos. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains some of the earliest references to the Anunnaki, though the versions we possess come from later periods. In this narrative, the Anunnaki serve as judges of the underworld, divine beings who determine the fates of the dead. They appear again in the flood narrative, where they gather in council to decide humanity's destruction. This wasn't their only function, though. Other texts describe the Anunnaki as offspring of An, the sky god, making them a distinct class of deities positioned between the highest gods and lesser divine servants called the Igigi. What did Anunnaki actually mean to those who wrote the word? The etymology derives from Anuna, which combines An, sky heaven, with Unna, offspring or descendants, effectively translating to those of royal blood or princely offspring of heaven. They weren't demons or monsters in Sumerian theology. They were members of the divine family, albeit junior members compared to the great gods who commanded storms, controlled the Euphrates flow, or governed the movement of Venus across the night sky. Why did these people invest so much effort in recording stories about gods? The question matters because writing was expensive, clay tablets required preparation, scribes demanded payment, and the physical space to store thousands of tablets necessitated dedicated archive rooms. Yet temples chose to allocate substantial resources toward preserving mythology alongside their economic records. This suggests the stories held genuine importance, serving functions beyond entertainment. They encoded cultural values, explained the origins of social hierarchies, justified the temple's economic power, and provided a framework for understanding human suffering, natural disasters, and the apparent randomness of fate. Consider the temple complex at Eridu, traditionally regarded as the oldest city in Sumer. Excavations revealed 17 successive building levels at the main temple site, showing continuous occupation and rebuilding from approximately 5400 BCE through 2000 BCE. The earliest levels contain no writing, naturally, but the architectural consistency suggests continuity of purpose. This was a sacred site for millennia before anyone could record why it mattered. When writing finally arrived, one of the first things committed to clay tablets was the story of Eridu itself, describing how the god Enki established his residence there, how he brought the arts of civilization up from the sacred freshwater abyss called the Abzu, and how this location served as the point of contact between divine and human realms. The Eridu Genesis, composed sometime before 2000 BCE, but likely preserving much older oral traditions, describes a golden age when only 5 cities existed, when kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, and when the gods walked among humanity before the great flood swept away that antediluvian world. The Anunnaki appear in this text as well, though their precise role remains somewhat unclear from the fragmentary tablets that survive. They're present at the creation of humanity, witness to the flood's approach, and involved somehow in the decision-making that leads to both creation and destruction. The night sky they observed hasn't changed much. Those same stars wheel overhead now, following the same paths they traced when Sumerian priests climbed ziggurat stairs to watch for astronomical omens. What has changed is our ability to read the words those priests left behind, to hear their voices speaking across 45 centuries, telling us what they believed about the gods who shaped their world. And whether we interpret those words as mythology, as garbled historical memory, or as something in between, the simple fact of their preservation feels almost miraculous. Fragile clay tablets surviving floods, fires, wars, and the collapse of civilizations, waiting in darkness until archaeologists would finally bring them back to light. The first person to hold a cuneiform tablet in centuries had no idea what he was looking at. When Austin Henry Layard began excavating the Assyrian palace at Nimrud in 1845, he encountered chamber after chamber filled with carved stone reliefs, colossal winged bulls with human heads, and thousands upon thousands of clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped marks that no living person could read. The tablets got packed into crates and shipped to the British Museum, where they sat largely ignored for years while scholars focused on the more visually impressive sculptures. Breaking the cuneiform code required patience, linguistic brilliance, and considerable luck. The key breakthrough came through the Behistun inscription, a massive trilingual text carved into a cliff face in western Iran by the Persian king Darius I, around 520 BCE. The inscription presented the same text in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, creating a Rosetta Stone effect. Henry Rawlinson spent years in the 1840s copying this inscription under dangerous conditions, hanging from ropes on the cliff face to reach certain sections, and through comparative analysis, he began to crack the cuneiform system. By the 1850s, scholars could read Akkadian, the Semitic language used by Babylonians and Assyrians, though Sumerian would remain more challenging for decades to come. George Smith changed everything in 1872. Working as a junior assistant at the British Museum, Smith was examining tablets from Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh when he encountered a text describing a great flood that destroyed the world, with one righteous man surviving by building a boat and preserving animals. The parallels to the biblical flood narrative were immediately apparent. Smith became so excited upon translating this passage that witnesses reported he began to strip off his clothes in the reading room. Overcome by the magnitude of his discovery, the Daily Telegraph funded an expedition to Iraq to search for missing fragments of the tablet, and when Smith successfully located additional pieces, the story became an international sensation. Victorian England didn't quite know what to make of these findings. Here were texts clearly older than the Hebrew Bible, containing stories that paralleled Genesis, composed by civilizations the Bible dismissed as pagan idolaters. Some scholars saw this as validation, evidence that biblical narratives preserved ancient truths also recognized by other cultures. Others viewed it as deeply threatening to scriptural authority. Debate raged in academic journals and popular press alike, with some theologians arguing the Babylonian texts must have borrowed from Hebrew sources, despite all chronological evidence pointing the opposite direction. The tablets kept coming. Excavations at Uruk, Nippur, and Lagash throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries produced hundreds of thousands of texts, many fragmentary, some nearly complete, covering everything from mathematical tables to medical prescriptions to epic poetry. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describing Marduk's battle against Tiamat, was pieced together from multiple tablet fragments found in Ashurbanipal's library. The Atrahasis epic, telling of divine rebellion and the creation of humanity, emerged from tablets scattered across several sites. The Sumerian king list, with its fantastically long pre-flood reigns, was reconstructed from more than a dozen different manuscript witnesses. Samuel Noah Kramer, working primarily in the 1930s through 1960s, made enormous contributions to Sumerian studies. His work translating temple hymns, wisdom literature, and mythological texts revealed the sophistication of Sumerian thought, their philosophical speculation about justice and mortality, and their complex theological framework in which the Anunnaki played important but not always clearly defined roles. Kramer titled one of his popular books, History Begins at Sumer, arguing that this civilization pioneered virtually every aspect of what we consider civilization: cities, writing, law codes, education systems, and complex theology. But translation is never simple or settled. Akkadian and Sumerian present different challenges, and scholarly consensus on how to render certain passages shifts as understanding deepens. The word Anunnaki itself has been translated variously as those of royal blood, princely offspring, judges of the underworld, or simply transliterated without interpretation. Context matters enormously. The Anunnaki who appear in the Enuma Elish aren't necessarily identical in function or character to the Anunnaki mentioned in earlier Sumerian sources, suggesting the concept evolved across cultures and centuries. Some tablets remained unpublished for decades after their discovery. The sheer volume of material overwhelmed the small number of scholars qualified to translate cuneiform, and much still sits untranslated in museum collections today. Estimates suggest we've published perhaps 30 to 40% of the cuneiform tablets recovered from Mesopotamian sites, with hundreds of thousands more awaiting scholarly attention. Each new translation potentially revises our understanding of Sumerian and Babylonian cosmology, adding nuance or occasionally contradicting what earlier texts seemed to establish. Zecharia Sitchin entered this landscape in 1976 with The 12th Planet, proposing a radically different interpretation of these ancient texts. Where academic scholars saw mythology and theological speculation, Sitchin claimed to see historical documentation of extraterrestrial visitors. He argued that the Anunnaki came from a planet called Nibiru on a 600-year elliptical orbit around our Sun, that they genetically engineered modern humans as a slave species to mine gold, and that the flood resulted from their advanced knowledge of celestial mechanics. Mainstream Assyriologists rejected these claims, pointing to linguistic errors in Sitchin's translations and archaeological evidence contradicting his chronologies. Yet his book sold millions of copies, translated into dozens of languages, inspiring a movement that continues today through writers like Eric von Daniken and television programs exploring ancient astronaut theories. The appeal is understandable. These texts do describe gods coming from the heavens, possessing advanced technologies, creating humans through divine methods, and witnessing catastrophic events. The question is whether we're reading metaphor or memory, whether ancient scribes described religious concepts in the vocabulary available to them, or preserved garbled accounts of actual historical events. Academic scholarship generally dismisses the ancient astronaut interpretation, while acknowledging the texts themselves remain fascinating and complex. The Anunnaki represented something important to the Sumerians and Babylonians, perhaps cosmic order, perhaps social hierarchy projected onto divine realms, perhaps humanity's attempt to understand their relationship with forces beyond their control. Whether those forces were genuinely supernatural, misunderstood natural phenomena, or visiting beings from another world, depends on how we choose to read words written in wet clay 45 centuries ago by people whose worldview differed fundamentally from our own. The tablets themselves remain. Touch one in a museum case, and you're placing your hand where a Sumerian scribe's hand rested, feeling the same cool clay, seeing the same wedge-shaped impressions. That direct physical connection to such distant human consciousness creates a strange intimacy, a bridge across time that makes these ancient voices feel suddenly immediate and real. Who were the Anunnaki, really, to the people who wrote their names in clay? This question matters because modern interpretations often strip away the theological context that gave these beings meaning. In Sumerian cosmology, the Anunnaki weren't aliens or demons. They were one category within an elaborate divine bureaucracy that mirrored earthly social structures. The word itself, as we've touched on briefly, derives from Anuna, combining An, sky or heaven, with Unna, offspring, making them literally the princely offspring of heaven, or those of royal blood descended from An. They were gods, yes, but not the highest gods. They occupied a middle tier in a cosmic hierarchy that Sumerian priests mapped with the same meticulous care they applied to surveying irrigation canals. An stood at the apex. The sky god, father of gods, though notably not the most active deity in most myths. His name is the Sumerian word for heaven itself, and he embodied the vault of stars that arched overhead each night. In the earliest god lists from around 2600 BCE, An's name appears first, establishing primacy, even if his mythological activity seems limited, compared to younger gods. His temple at Uruk, the Iana complex, covered approximately 9,000 square meters by 3000 BCE, and employed hundreds of people in various economic and ritual capacities. Enlil commanded more active worship, lord of the wind, the storm, the atmosphere between earth and heaven. Enlil appears in texts as powerful, occasionally volatile, the god who brings both life-giving rain and destructive floods. His cult center at Nippur held such importance that control of this city conferred legitimacy on Mesopotamian kings for thousands of years. The ziggurat there, rebuilt multiple times, stood roughly 43 meters tall at its maximum extent, a mountain of baked brick that could be seen from 15 kilometers away across the flat alluvial plain. Enki presented a different character entirely, god of fresh water, wisdom, magic and crafts. Enki appears in myths as clever, sometimes mischievous, frequently the deity who saves humanity from the harsh decisions of other gods. His city was Eridu, and his domain was the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, feeding springs and rivers. This wasn't pure mythology. The region sits atop substantial aquifers, and anyone digging a well quickly encountered water, making the concept of a subsurface ocean seem perfectly reasonable. The Anunnaki served these greater gods. Think of them as divine nobility rather than divine royalty, aristocrats who possessed genuine power and status, but remained subordinate to the king and his highest ministers. Texts describe them numbering 50, though some sources list more, others fewer. They appear most frequently as judges, particularly in underworld contexts, determining fates of the dead and maintaining cosmic order. The Epic of Gilgamesh places them in the underworld palace, seated in assembly, weighing the worth of mortal lives. But there was another class of divine beings, the Igigi. The relationship between Anunnaki and Igigi shifts depending on which text you read and from which period. Generally, the Igigi appear as younger gods, laborers who perform the physical work of maintaining creation, while the Anunnaki occupy higher positions of authority and judgment. This distinction becomes crucial in the Atrahasis epic, where it's the Igigi who rebel against their endless toil, forcing the gods to find an alternative solution. We'll explore that story more deeply soon, but for now, understand that Sumerian theology recognized gradations of divine power, just as their society recognized gradations of human status. Inanna, later called Ishtar, was perhaps the most complex deity, goddess of love and warfare, sex and destruction, the planet Venus and the storehouse door. She appears in more myths than almost any other figure. Her temple at Uruk featured elaborate decorations, including cone mosaics creating geometric patterns across exterior walls, each colored clay cone pressed into mud brick, approximately 10 centimeters deep. Standing before these walls in afternoon light, the patterns would have shimmered slightly, hundreds of thousands of individual cones creating an effect both hypnotic and architecturally impressive. What did ordinary people think about these gods? Archaeological evidence from household shrines suggests daily worship focused on practical concerns, health, fertility, protection from demons and disease. Small clay figurines, typically 8 to 15 centimeters tall, represented various deities and could be purchased or commissioned for home altars. Prayers inscribed on tablets reveal touching humanity, requests for sick children to recover, for difficult births to proceed safely, for debts to be forgiven, or enemies to be thwarted. The theological framework we're describing emerged gradually, standardized through centuries of scribal tradition and priestly authority. Earlier periods may have understood these relationships differently, and regional variations certainly existed. Lagash emphasized different deities than Uruk, and what mattered in Uruk didn't necessarily matter in Kish, yet certain core concepts persisted: the idea that divine beings existed in hierarchical relationship, that they influenced earthly events, that they sometimes fought among themselves, and that humanity existed in a dependent relationship with these powers. Here's something remarkable to consider. The people who developed this theology were among the first literate cultures in human history, emerging from perhaps 10,000 years of purely oral tradition. When they gained the ability to write things down permanently, one of their first priorities was mapping divine relationships, establishing which gods held what powers, determining proper ritual procedures, and recording the stories that explained how the world came to be. This suggests something profound about human consciousness, that the moment we could preserve knowledge across generations, we chose to preserve our understanding of the sacred. The stars still wheel overhead just as they did when Sumerian priests climbed ziggurat stairs to observe their movements, seeking divine messages in planetary positions and lunar phases. Those priests believed they were watching the gods themselves move across heaven, and whether we interpret their observations as astronomy or astrology, the precision of their tracking demonstrates sophisticated mathematical capability. They were trying to understand the cosmos through the conceptual framework available to them, just as we do with our own tools and terminology. And within that cosmos, the Anunnaki held their place: judges, offspring of An, members of the Divine Council, witnesses to creation and catastrophe. But what catastrophes did the texts actually describe? What wars among these gods did Sumerian and Babylonian scribes feel compelled to record? Let's turn now to the specific narratives that speak of divine conflict, examining what these ancient voices actually said about battles in heaven and the end of ages. The Enuma Elish begins not with war but with water. When the heavens above did not yet exist, nor the earth below, there was Apsu, the primeval freshwater, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, and from their mingling all things came. This is how the Babylonian creation epic opens. written in Akkadian cuneiform on 7 tablets dating to approximately 1200 BCE, though likely preserving much older material. The text was discovered in fragments at multiple sites, with the most complete version coming from Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh. Apsu and Tiamat represent the original divine couple, primordial waters whose union produces younger gods. These younger gods are noisy, disturbing Apsu's rest with their activity and celebration. Annoyed beyond tolerance, Apsu decides to destroy his own offspring to restore peace. Tiamat resists this plan, but Apsu proceeds anyway, prompting Enki to act first. He uses magic to put Apsu into a deep sleep, then kills him, establishing his own dwelling place over Apsu's remains. This murder sets in motion the cosmic war that dominates the epic. Tiamat, grieving and enraged, decides to avenge Apsu's death. She creates an army of monsters, 11 types described in vivid detail, including snake dragons, fishmen, storm demons, and creatures with scorpion bodies and human faces. She appoints Kingu as her champion, giving him the Tablet of Destinies, a cosmic artifact that grants authority to determine fate. The younger gods panic when they learn of Tiamat's army, gathering in council to decide how to respond. None dare face her directly, until Marduk, son of Enki, volunteers under one condition. If he defeats Tiamat, he must be recognized as king of all gods. The battle itself gets described with remarkable intensity. Marduk arms himself with bow, mace, lightning, and a net woven from winds. He creates 7 storms to accompany him: the evil wind, the whirlwind, the hurricane, the fourfold wind, the sevenfold wind, the cyclone, and the irresistible wind. When he confronts Tiamat, she opens her mouth to swallow him, and he drives the evil wind into her jaws, inflating her body until she cannot close her mouth. Then he shoots an arrow that splits her heart, killing the primordial ocean. What Marduk does next shapes everything. He splits Tiamat's corpse in half like a shellfish, using one half to create the dome of heaven and the other to form the earth below. From her eyes flow the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. From her tail and scattered body parts he fashions mountains, clouds, and the mechanisms of weather. Order emerges from chaos, cosmos from combat, and creation from the body of the defeated enemy. The Anunnaki appear in this text primarily as witnesses and supporters. After Marduk's victory, they gather to acknowledge his supremacy, granting him the 50 names that enumerate his powers and functions. Tablet 6 describes how Marduk proposes creating humanity to serve the gods, relieving them of labor. Kingu, captured after the battle, is executed, and from his blood mixed with clay, the first human is fashioned. The epic ends with the construction of Marduk's temple in Babylon, a celebration of divine and earthly order. But this wasn't the only text describing divine conflict. The Atrahasis epic, composed probably around 1700 BCE, based on old Babylonian tablet fragments, tells a different story with similar themes. In this narrative, the Agigi gods labor endlessly, digging rivers and canals for 40 years, growing increasingly resentful of their servitude. They finally rebel, burning their tools and marching on Enlil's residence. The greater gods convene in emergency council, debating how to respond to this unprecedented insurrection. Enki proposes a solution: create humanity to take over the physical labor. The goddess Nintu, also called Beletili, shapes humans from clay mixed with the blood of a sacrificed god. The text specifies 7 males and 7 females initially, created to bear the burden the Agigi refused. This resolves the immediate crisis, but introduces new complications as humanity multiplies rapidly, becoming noisy and troublesome, just as the younger gods once annoyed Apsu. Enlil decides to reduce human population through plague, then drought, then finally a catastrophic flood. Each time Enki warns his faithful servant Atrahasis, helping him survive the divine punishment. When the flood comes, Atrahasis builds a boat, seals it with bitumen, loads it with animals and provisions, and weathers the deluge while the rest of humanity perishes. The Anunnaki themselves reportedly regret the destruction, weeping as they watch the floodwaters rise, crouching like dogs in fear of the devastation they've unleashed. George Smith's 1872 discovery of the flood narrative from the Epic of Gilgamesh created international sensation, as mentioned earlier, but the actual moment deserves fuller attention. Smith was 32 years old, a former engraver who taught himself cuneiform through obsessive study at the British Museum. On November 1872, he was examining fragments from Ashurbanipal's library, specifically Tablet 11 of what would become known as the standard version of Gilgamesh. The tablet describes Utnapishtim's account of the flood, and as Smith translated the words, he realized he was reading a Mesopotamian parallel to the Genesis narrative, composed centuries before the Hebrew text. The tablet itself measures approximately 15 by 11 centimeters, inscribed on both sides in neat cuneiform columns. Smith sat in the museum's reading room, natural light coming through tall windows, his notes and reference works spread across a wooden table. As he worked through the Akkadian text, the story emerged: divine assembly deciding to flood the earth, one righteous man warned by the god Ea, Akkadian name for Enki, construction of a boat with specific dimensions, preservation of animals, waters rising to cover mountains, eventual landing on Mount Nisir. According to witnesses, Smith became so excited he began removing his clothing, an odd Victorian display of scholarly enthusiasm that became part of the anecdote's retelling. The Daily Telegraph offered 1,000 guineas to fund an expedition to Nineveh to search for missing portions of the tablet. Smith travelled to Iraq in 1873, and incredibly, within 5 days of beginning excavations, he found the missing fragment describing the flood's duration. The odds of this discovery seem astronomical, yet it happened, one small piece of baked clay emerging from thousands of years of burial to complete a story. These war narratives share common elements: divine beings in conflict, often motivated by noise or labor disputes, younger gods challenging or threatening older powers, violence resulting in creation or transformation, humanity created as subordinate beings to serve divine purposes, floods as reset mechanisms when humanity itself becomes problematic. The Anunnaki appear throughout these texts, sometimes as active participants, more often as council members witnessing and judging events. How should we read these stories? Academic scholarship treats them as mythology encoding cultural values, social anxieties, and theological speculation. The violence reflects Mesopotamian political reality. Kingship was established through conquest. Cities rose and fell through warfare, and cosmic order seemed to require violence for its establishment. Alternative interpretations suggest these texts preserve memories of actual events, perhaps cosmic catastrophes or conflicts between advanced civilizations, described in the only vocabulary available to ancient witnesses. The texts themselves remain ambiguous enough to support multiple readings, which may be part of their enduring power. They invite interpretation while resisting definitive conclusions, allowing each generation to find new meanings within the same ancient words. And those words, pressed into clay tablets more than 3,000 years ago, still wait in museum collections and archaeological sites, silent witnesses to questions we're still trying to answer about human origins, cosmic order, and the mysterious beings called the Anunnaki. The Sumerian king list presents a problem, copied and recopied across centuries, existing in multiple versions with variations. This document attempts to catalogue every ruler from the moment kingship descended from heaven through the historical period when Mesopotamian chronology becomes verifiable through astronomical records and cross-references with other cultures. But the early portions of this list stretch credibility to breaking points and beyond. Before the flood, according to the standard version, there were 5 cities where kingship was exercised: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. 8 kings ruled during this antediluvian period, with reigns lasting 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. 1 king supposedly ruled for 64,800 years. The total comes to 241,200 years of pre-flood kingship, a chronology impossible to reconcile with either archaeology or human biology as we understand it. Then the text states simply, the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descends again from heaven, this time to Kish. The post-flood reigns are still impossibly long by modern standards, but noticeably shorter than the antediluvian period. Gradually, as the list progresses toward historical times, the reign lengths decrease further, eventually reaching plausible human lifespans around 2600 BCE, when we can begin cross-checking against other evidence. What are we supposed to do with these numbers? Scholarly consensus treats them as theological rather than historical, expressing the idea that the pre-flood world existed in a different relationship with divine time, that those ancient ages operated under different rules than the post-flood era. Some researchers have proposed the numbers encode mathematical patterns or astronomical cycles rather than literal years. Others suggest they represent dynastic periods rather than individual reigns. A few alternative researchers argue the numbers should be taken at face value, indicating either mistaken chronology or something genuinely anomalous about early human history. The cities mentioned in the king list all existed, or at least their names correspond to real archaeological sites. Eridu shows continuous occupation from approximately 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest settled locations in Mesopotamia. Excavations there revealed temple architecture rebuilt in essentially the same spot for millennia, suggesting remarkable cultural continuity. The lowest levels, before any monumental architecture, contained fish bones and painted pottery, remnants of communities who lived along the marshy coastline when the Persian Gulf extended further inland. Shuruppak, the last city mentioned before the flood, has a special significance. Archaeological excavations in the 1920s and 1930s revealed a layer of water-laid clay approximately 60 centimeters thick, separating pre-flood from post-flood occupation levels. Similar flood deposits appear at Uruk, and Kish, though not at precisely the same depth or dated to exactly the same period, suggesting multiple localized flooding events rather than one single catastrophic deluge. The most substantial flood layer at was discovered by Leonard Woolley in 1929. His team had been digging through occupation layers, working downward through progressively older material, when they encountered clean water-laid silt with no pottery, no artifacts, no evidence of human presence. Woolley initially thought they'd reached bedrock, but he ordered the excavation to continue. After penetrating 2.4 meters of sterile silt, they found another occupation layer beneath, complete with pottery and tools of a distinctly earlier style. Woolley became convinced he'd found evidence of the biblical flood, and his announcement created international headlines. More careful analysis revealed the deposit dated to approximately 3,800 BCE, covering only a portion of the ancient city rather than the entire region, suggesting a severe but localized flood event. Similar analysis of flood layers at other sites showed they occurred at different times, none matching the chronology implied by the king list or biblical narrative. The floods were real, undoubtedly catastrophic for those who experienced them, but probably regional rather than global phenomena. Yet the memory of these floods became enshrined in multiple traditions: the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, and eventually the Genesis account in Hebrew scripture, all preserve flood narratives with striking similarities: divine decision to destroy humanity, one righteous man warned and saved, animals preserved, eventual landing and renewal. These stories suggest flood catastrophes left deep marks on Mesopotamian cultural memory, becoming the boundary marker between mythic and historical time. The texts describe beings who knew the flood was coming. In Atrahasis, Enki warns Atrahasis despite the divine council's decision to keep the coming destruction secret. In Gilgamesh, Ea similarly warns Utamishtim by speaking to the reed walls of his house, technically not breaking the oath to keep silent while still conveying essential information. These gods appear as rebels against divine consensus, preserving human life and knowledge, when other gods intended complete annihilation. What knowledge did these survivors preserve? The texts mention that antediluvian sages called Apakalu brought civilization to humanity before the flood, teaching writing, mathematics, agriculture, astronomy, temple architecture, and proper ritual. 7 AP Kalu are typically listed, associated with the 7 antediluvian cities. After the flood, their knowledge survives through texts they supposedly buried, or through teaching they imparted to post-flood sages. This theme of preserved knowledge appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian tradition. The idea that a golden age preceded our current era, that wisdom was greater before the catastrophe than after, that we're living in diminished times, trying to recover what was lost. It's a melancholic view of history, opposite from modern progressivism, that assumes each generation knows more than the previous. For the Sumerians and Babylonians, the trajectory pointed backward toward an age of greater divine human contact. Archaeological reality complicates this picture. Material culture shows clear development over time, with technology and organizational complexity increasing rather than decreasing. The earliest post-flood layers show simpler architecture, cruder pottery, and smaller settlements than appear in later periods. If there was a golden age, the physical evidence doesn't support it, unless that age existed so far in the past that its traces have dissolved back into the earth. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the flood narratives aren't about literal chronology, but about something else entirely: the anxiety that what we build will not last, that knowledge can be lost, that catastrophe can sweep away civilization despite all our efforts toward permanence. Every culture that developed writing seemed compelled to record flood stories, as if putting the fear into words might somehow protect against it happening again. The Anunnaki witness all of this in the texts. They gather in council to decide humanity's fate. They weep when the waters rise. They smell the sweet savour when Utnapishtim finally makes sacrifice after the flood recedes. They're portrayed as powerful, but not omnipotent, capable of tremendous destruction but also capable of regret, bound by their own decisions, yet occasionally willing to subvert those decisions to preserve what they value. And what they value, at least in some texts, is humanity, not for our intrinsic worth necessarily, but for our utility, our worship, our sacrifices that feed them. This creates a relationship both transactional and oddly intimate. Gods depend on humans, just as humans depend on gods, a mutual need that complicates simple hierarchies of power. The night sky witnessed all of this. If we believe the texts, the same stars that turn overhead now, following paths the Sumerians charted carefully, watching as cities rose and fell, as floods came and receded, as ages ended and began again. What comes next in our exploration requires looking upward, examining what these ancient people saw when they studied the heavens, and what they believed about cosmic mechanisms and divine technologies that might explain the powers attributed to the Anunnaki. The creation of the world required violence. This is what the Enuma Elish teaches, and it's a teaching that runs counter to many modern creation narratives that imagine peaceful divine will bringing cosmos from void. But in Babylonian cosmology, order emerged from combat, structure from struggle, and the world we inhabit was literally fashioned from the corpse of a defeated enemy. Marduk's battle against Tiamat wasn't a minor skirmish. The text devotes substantial space to describing his preparations, listing his weapons with the care a craftsman might catalogue his tools. He carried a bow and quiver, a mace that he grasped in his right hand, lightning that danced before him, and a net woven from the four winds to entangle his enemy. But his primary weapons were the winds themselves, 7 storms he created specifically for this confrontation. Imagine the scene as the scribes recorded it. Tiamat advancing as a massive serpentine form, embodiment of saltwater chaos, flanked by her army of hybrid monsters, Marduk approaching alone but armed with cosmic forces, the winds swirling around him like loyal servants waiting for commands, the other gods watching from a safe distance, everything depending on this young champion who demanded kingship as payment for his service. The battle's turning point comes through clever strategy rather than brute force. When Tiamat opens her jaws to swallow Marduk, he drives the evil wind into her mouth. The wind inflates her body from within, distending her until she cannot close her jaws, leaving her vulnerable. Marduk shoots an arrow that travels down her throat, splitting her heart. The primordial ocean dies, and from her death, all things are born. What he does with her body reveals sophisticated cosmological thinking. He splits her corpse like someone preparing shellfish, using the upper half to create the vault of heaven and the lower half to form the earth. Her eyes become the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates, suggesting these rivers were seen as somehow alive, tears flowing eternally from the slain goddess. Her ribs form the architecture of the sky, creating the framework on which stars and planets would move. Her tail becomes mountains, her spittle becomes clouds and mist. This imagery isn't random or primitive. It represents a coherent theory about the structure of reality, one where the natural world emerges from divine substance, where geography has sacred meaning, and where the cosmos itself is a constructed artifact, rather than an eternal given. Marduk doesn't simply wave creation into existence. He builds it, shapes it, organizes it with the skill of a master architect working with existing materials. After the victory, Marduk organizes the heavens. He creates stations for the great gods, establishes constellations, sets the moon to measure months at 30 days, and positions the sun to mark the year. This astronomical ordering appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian texts, suggesting the movement of celestial bodies was understood as divinely mandated, their paths as fixed and purposeful as temple rituals or irrigation schedules. The Anunnaki's role in this narrative comes after the battle concludes. They gather to acknowledge Marduk's supremacy, granting him 50 names that enumerate his powers and responsibilities. Each name carries significance. Asaru, who grants cultivation; Namru, who is bright and brilliant; Asaruluhi, who oversees magical arts. The recitation of these names takes up substantial portions of tablets 6 and 7, functioning almost like a catechism, establishing theological truths through repetitive naming. But creation wasn't finished. Marduk proposes making humanity to relieve the gods of labor. Kingu, who led Tiamat's army and wore the Tablet of Destinies, is executed for his rebellion. From his blood mixed with clay, the first human is fashioned. The text specifies that humanity's purpose is service, to bear the burden of maintaining creation, to provide offerings and worship, to free the gods from physical toil. This is a utilitarian view of human existence. We weren't created out of love or loneliness or even curiosity, according to this text. We were created to work, to serve, to maintain the cosmic machinery through ritual and agriculture and the daily grinding labor of survival. It's a sobering theology, one that positions humanity as fundamentally subordinate, existing at divine pleasure for divine convenience. Yet there's something almost honest in this vision. Agricultural civilization did require relentless labor. Irrigation canals needed constant maintenance. Crops demanded attention through precise seasonal cycles. Temple complexes employed hundreds in various capacities from the sacred to the mundane. The Babylonian creation myth reflects this reality. projecting earthly social structures onto cosmic origins. The Enuma Elish was recited annually during the Akitu festival, Babylon's New Year celebration held during the spring equinox. For 11 days, priests enacted rituals, symbolically reenacting creation, re-establishing cosmic order, and renewing Marduk's kingship. The king himself participated, undergoing humiliation and renewal that mirrored the cycle of death and rebirth central to agricultural religion. This wasn't abstract theology, but lived practice, a way of continuously recreating the world through ritual performance. Standing in Babylon during the Akitu festival around 600 BCE, you would have witnessed processions moving through streets decorated with coloured banners, heard chanting that lasted hours, smelled incense and roasting meat from countless sacrifices, and felt yourself part of something ancient and ongoing, a human thread in the cosmic tapestry that Marduk wove from Tiamat's body. The city itself, with its massive walls stretching 18 kilometers around the urban core, and the Ishtar Gate decorated with glazed brick dragons in brilliant blue and gold, embodied the order and magnificence that emerged from primordial chaos. But other texts told different stories about human creation and the motivations behind it. The Atrahasis epic presents a scenario where humanity emerged not from divine triumph, but from divine exhaustion, where our existence solved a labor dispute among the gods themselves. And in that telling, the Anunnaki play a different role entirely. 40 years of digging. That's how long the Atrahasis epic says the Agigi gods labored before they finally rebelled. 40 years of excavating canals and rivers, moving earth under the harsh Mesopotamian sun, their divine hands blistered and backs aching from work that never seemed to finish. The rebellion begins at night. The Agigi gather in secret, passing word among themselves until all are assembled. They take their tools, the same spades and baskets they've used for 4 decades, and they burn them, setting fire to the instruments of their servitude. Then they march on Enlil's residence, surrounding it while he sleeps, their anger finally overwhelming their fear of consequences. Enlil wakes to find his palace surrounded by angry gods. He summons Anu and Enki to emergency council, and together the 3 great gods must confront an unprecedented crisis. The divine order they established is breaking down, the cosmic hierarchy challenged by those at its bottom. What happens when even gods refuse to work? The council's solution comes from Enki, always the clever one, always finding ways around impossible problems. Create new beings to bear the burden, he suggests. Make creatures specifically designed for labor, beings who can maintain creation without divine suffering. The goddess Beletili, also called Nintu or Ninhursag depending on the text, agrees to shape these new creatures, and so humanity comes into existence as replacement workers for exhausted gods. The creation process gets described with startling specificity. A god must be slaughtered to provide the essential ingredient, divine blood mixed with clay. The text names this sacrificed god as Wiela, or Geshtu'e, described as having intelligence, or rationality, that will be transferred to the new beings through his blood. Beleteli shapes 14 pieces of clay, 7 that will become males and 7 that will become females, placing them in pairs. 9 months later, the first humans are born. This detail, the 9-month gestation period, grounds mythological narrative in biological reality, suggesting the scribes wanted to connect cosmic events to observable processes. Humans emerge from clay and blood, and divine gestation following the same timeline as ordinary births, blurring the boundary between sacred narrative and natural phenomenon. Now imagine daily life in Uruk, around 2900 BCE, after humanity has multiplied and spread across the fertile plains. A farmer named Urnanshe wakes before dawn in his mud brick house on the city's outskirts. Single-room structure with reed matting covering the dirt floor, and a small courtyard where his goats sleep. The air is cool, briefly, before the day's heat arrives. Urnanshe drinks water from a clay jar, eats a barley cake left from yesterday's baking, and walks toward the canal that irrigates his barley field. The canal needs clearing, silt accumulates constantly, and without maintenance it will clog completely within weeks. He carries a basket and a wooden spade, tools that echo on a human scale the divine implements the Agigi once wielded. He works through the morning, scooping mud from the canal bottom and piling it on the banks. The sun climbs, heat intensifying until sweat soaks through his linen kilt. His hands ache, his back complains, and the work seems endless, just as it must have seemed to the Agigi before their rebellion. By midday he's cleared perhaps 20 meters of canal, a tiny fraction of the network that feeds water to thousands of fields surrounding the city. He'll return tomorrow, and the next day, maintaining what the gods apparently decided they could no longer maintain themselves. The Atrahasis epic continues beyond human creation, describing how humanity multiplies rapidly, becoming numerous and noisy. This noise, the text emphasizes, disturbs Enlil's rest just as the younger gods once disturbed Apsu. The pattern repeats. Creation leads to multiplication, leads to disturbance, leads to annihilation contemplated. Enlil tries plague first, sending disease to reduce human population. Enki instructs his faithful servant Atrahasis to worship Namtar, the plague god, until the sickness relents. Enlil tries drought next, withholding rain for 7 years until famine grips the land. Again Enki intervenes, teaching Atrahasis how to survive and how to propitiate the gods controlling water. Each time, Enlil's destructive intent meets Enki's protective subversion, establishing a pattern that will culminate in the flood narrative. But before that catastrophe, there's this middle period described in various texts, an age when humanity has been created but the flood hasn't yet come, when divine and human worlds interact regularly, when gods walk among their creations and humans serve their makers directly. This is perhaps the true golden age in Mesopotamian imagination, not the primordial chaos before creation, but the organized world after creation, where everyone knows their place and performs their function. Temple employment records from the early dynastic period, around 2600 to 2350 BCE, reveal massive institutions. The Temple of Bao at Lagash employed 1,200 people in various capacities, distributed monthly rations of barley and oil, owned approximately 10,000 hectares of agricultural land, and maintained herds numbering in the thousands. These weren't small operations but economic powerhouses that dominated regional production and distribution. Workers at these temples performed tasks both sacred and mundane. Priests conducted daily rituals, feeding and clothing divine statues, maintaining the fiction or reality, depending on your theology, that gods actually dwelt in their earthly houses. Brewers produced beer in staggering quantities, as beer was both ritual offering and payment to workers. Weavers made textiles that clothed both gods and priests. Farmers worked temple lands. Fishermen brought catches from the rivers and marshes. Scribes recorded every transaction, every movement of goods, every ritual performance. This bureaucratic complexity suggests something the mythological texts also convey, that maintaining cosmic order requires constant work, that the relationship between divine and human spheres functions through exchange, that worship involves not just devotion but production, not just prayer but labor. The Agigi refused this work, so humans assumed it, and in assuming it we became essential to the continued functioning of reality itself. The Anunnaki oversee this arrangement from their position in the divine hierarchy. They judge, they witness, they occasionally intervene, but mostly they maintain the cosmic bureaucracy that keeps everything operating according to established patterns. They're administrators of divinity, and the texts present them as neither purely benevolent nor malevolent, but simply functional, doing the work assigned to them within a system they didn't necessarily create. Yet tools more impressive than spades and baskets appear in these texts when describing divine action. The gods possess technologies that seem to transcend anything available to Bronze Age humanity, and those technologies become essential to understanding what the texts claim about divine powers. The gods fought with weapons that don't quite match anything from the human arsenal. When texts describe Marduk's armaments or Ninurta's conquests, they use vocabulary that translates awkwardly, leaving scholars debating whether we're reading about actual objects, metaphorical forces, or something between those categories. Consider the me first. These are divine powers or principles or possibly technologies. The term is famously difficult to translate, that govern reality. Lists enumerate over 100 me, including kingship, priesthood, music, writing, metalworking, sexual intercourse, warfare, and more abstract concepts like truth and falsehood. The goddess Inanna steals the me from Enki in one famous myth, getting him drunk and escaping with these cosmic essentials before he realizes what's happened. She loads them onto her boat and sails from Eridu to Uruk, transforming her city through the acquisition of these divine principles. But the me aren't just abstract ideas. They seem to function like transferable objects, things that can be stolen, moved, possessed, activated. Enki keeps them in the Abzu, his underground freshwater palace, suggesting they require storage and protection. When Inanna obtains them, civilization in Uruk advances, implying they have measurable effects on human capabilities. This has led some researchers to wonder if the me describe lost technologies or knowledge systems rather than purely theological concepts. Ninurta's weapon, Sharur, deserves attention. Described as both a mace and somehow sentient, Sharur can fly independently to scout enemy positions, returning to report what it discovers. It speaks to Ninurta, offering advice during battles, and strikes his enemies with devastating force. The text describes it as a fierce storm that rains down upon the rebel lands, suggesting either enormous destructive power or perhaps poetic exaggeration of a particularly effective weapon. The Tablet of Destinies appears in multiple narratives, most importantly when Tiamat gives it to Kingu during her war against the younger gods. Whoever holds the Tablet of Destinies can determine fate, issue commands that must be obeyed, and control cosmic mechanisms. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and captures Kingu, he takes the tablet, confirming his authority over reality itself. Later myths describe the Anzu bird stealing the tablet from Enlil, creating cosmic chaos until Ninurta retrieves it through heroic combat. What could this object possibly be? Scholars debate whether it represents abstract authority, a physical artifact with symbolic meaning, or something genuinely powerful in a material sense. The texts treat it as crucially important, its possession determining who rules heaven and earth, suggesting it functions as more than metaphor. Enki's boat presents another puzzle. He travels in a vessel called the Boat of Heaven, described as capable of moving through water, through air, and to the ends of the universe. This might be poetic language for a god's unlimited mobility, or it might describe technology beyond Bronze Age comprehension being recorded in available vocabulary. The boat appears in narratives where Enki travels to distant lands, brings civilization to remote peoples, and moves between the Abzu and the surface world with ease. Divine weapons in the Enuma Elish include specific winds that Marduk creates or commands, the evil wind that inflates Tiamat's body, the four winds, the seven winds, the whirlwind, and others are listed almost like military units, each with distinct characteristics and tactical applications. Whether these represent actual atmospheric manipulation or mythological personification of natural forces remains ambiguous in the text. The texts also describe divine radiance or melamu, a terrifying brilliance that gods emanate, causing humans and lesser beings to fall prostrate in fear. Kings sometimes claim to possess melamu, suggesting it could be transferred or manifested in human rulers. Gilgamesh is described as possessing 2/3 divine nature, giving him access to melamu that ordinary humans lack. This radiance isn't merely metaphorical, the texts imply, but something visible and physically affecting. Astronomical knowledge encoded in these divine descriptions becomes apparent when examining how gods relate to celestial bodies. Inanna is Venus, the morning and evening star. Shamash is the sun, travelling through the underworld at night to emerge again at dawn. Sin is the moon, measuring months through his phases. Marduk's 50 names include associations with Jupiter, and his elevation to supreme deity may reflect Jupiter's dominant brightness among the planets. The Mul.Appian tablets, composed around 1000 BCE, but likely preserving much older knowledge, catalogue stars, constellations and planetary movements with impressive precision. They list heliacal risings, the first appearance of stars after their period of invisibility, due to proximity to the sun, with accuracy suggesting centuries of systematic observation. They provide instructions for creating accurate calendars, tracking solstices and equinoxes, and predicting lunar eclipses. This astronomical sophistication appears in temple architecture as well. The ziggurats weren't randomly oriented, but aligned to cardinal directions with remarkable precision, often within 1 degree of true north. Some scholars argue these structures serve dual purposes, as temples and observatories, with priests climbing to the summit platforms to track celestial movements and record omens. The question becomes whether divine technologies in the texts describe natural phenomena misunderstood by pre-scientific people, whether they preserve memories of actual advanced capabilities lost to time, or whether they represent purely mythological imagination. Academic consensus strongly favors the first interpretation, that Mesopotamians were creating poetic theology to explain their world, personifying forces they couldn't otherwise comprehend. Alternative researchers point to the specificity of certain descriptions, arguing that ancient people would have recognized ordinary objects and natural phenomena, that if they described gods wielding unusual weapons or traveling in strange vehicles, perhaps they witnessed something genuinely anomalous. This interpretation faces the burden of providing evidence for lost civilizations or extraterrestrial contact, evidence that remains controversial at best. The texts themselves don't resolve this question. They present divine actions as real events, while using language that allows multiple interpretations, and maybe that's intentional. Maybe the scribes who shaped these narratives across centuries wanted to preserve mystery alongside meaning, to record what they believed or witnessed, while acknowledging the limits of human language to capture divine reality. What seems certain is that Mesopotamian culture possessed sophisticated knowledge in multiple domains: astronomy, mathematics, architecture, metallurgy, agriculture, and administration. Whether they attributed this knowledge to divine teaching or human discovery varies across texts, but the capability itself is undeniable. Standing in the ruins of Babylon today, you can still see the Ishtar Gate's foundations, still trace the street called Processional Way, still measure the precise alignments in structures built 600 years ago. And you can wonder what they saw when they looked up at the stars, what they believed about the beings who governed those lights, and whether the cosmic war they described in their creation myths referred to something that once happened in the heavens they so carefully observed. The flood came not as natural disaster, but as deliberate divine decision. This distinction matters when reading the texts, because it frames catastrophe not as accident or misfortune, but as purposeful destruction, a calculated choice by divine powers to unmake what they had made. In the Atrahasis epic, Enlil grows increasingly frustrated with humanity's noise and numbers. After plague and drought fail to sufficiently reduce the population due to Enki's interventions, he proposes a final solution: total annihilation through water. The Divine Council agrees, swearing an oath to keep their decision secret from humanity, ensuring no one can escape the coming destruction. But Enki finds a loophole. He cannot speak directly to his faithful servant Atrahasis without breaking the oath, so instead he speaks to the reed walls of Atrahasis's house, ostensibly addressing the structure rather than the man inside. Wall, listen to my words, Enki says, then proceeds to explain exactly how to build a boat, what dimensions to use, how to seal it with bitumen, what to bring aboard, and when the flood will begin. The boat's construction requires 7 days. Atrahasis gathers materials, recruits workers by telling them he's building a residence to flee Enlil's anger, a technical truth that conceals the full apocalyptic scope. The finished vessel measures 7 stories tall according to some versions, with compartments for different types of animals, living quarters for his family, and storage for provisions that must last until dry land emerges again. The flood itself arrives with terrifying intensity. The texts describe wind and rain so violent that even the gods cower in fear, climbing to the highest heaven to escape the rising waters. The Anunnaki reportedly weep, seeing the destruction they've sanctioned, crouching like dogs in distress as humanity drowns below them. This is a remarkable image, divine beings experiencing regret, fear and sorrow over consequences of their own decision. The goddess Biletili, who shaped the first humans from clay and blood, laments especially deeply. "How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods?" she cries, according to one translation. "How could I order battle to destroy my people?" The texts present her as grieving mother, horrified by the annihilation of beings she created, yet powerless to reverse what the Divine Council has decreed. For 6 days and 7 nights the flood continues, waters covering mountains, destroying all life except what Atrahasis preserved in his boat. On the 7th day, the storm finally subsides, and an eerie silence settles over the drowned world. Atrahasis opens a window, sends out birds to search for land, and eventually the boat comes to rest on a mountain called Nisir, in some versions, or simply a mountain in others. When Atrahasis finally exits the boat and makes sacrifice, the gods smell the offering and gather around it like flies, desperately hungry after days without worship or offerings. This detail reveals the transactional nature of the divine-human relationship in Mesopotamian theology. Gods need human service as much as humans need divine protection, creating genuine interdependence, rather than simple hierarchy. Enlil arrives at the mountain furious to discover humanity has survived. "How did any man escape?" he demands. A tense confrontation follows between Enlil and Enki, with Enlil accusing Enki of breaking the oath, and Enki defending his actions through technicalities. Eventually a compromise is reached. Humanity will be allowed to continue existing, but under new conditions that limit population growth through infant mortality, infertility, and celibate priestesses. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells essentially the same story through Utanapishtim's narration to Gilgamesh, though with Babylonian rather than Sumerian names for the gods. Utanapishtim builds his boat, preserves life through the deluge, sends out birds to find land, makes sacrifice that draws the gods. As reward for his obedience and service, he and his wife receive immortality, becoming the only humans to escape death, though they must live far away from ordinary human civilization at the edge of the world. Archaeological evidence for catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia exists but proves complicated. Flood deposits at Uruk, Shuruppak and Kish date to different periods, suggesting localized disasters rather than one single global deluge. The most substantial deposits date between 3800 and 2900 BCE, severe enough to destroy settlements and disrupt continuity, but regional rather than worldwide in scope. Yet the memory persisted across millennia and cultures. The flood became the boundary marker between ages, the event that separated the antediluvian golden age from the diminished present. Before the flood, according to the Sumerian king list, Kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, lifespans decreased dramatically, eventually reaching merely human durations. Before the flood, gods and humans interacted directly. After the flood, that contact became mediated through priests, rituals, and written texts. What knowledge was lost in the flood? The texts mention that antediluvian sages, the Apalu, possessed wisdom that had to be preserved or reconstructed. Some narratives describe burying texts or inscriptions before the flood, so they could be recovered afterward. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself frames its narrative as ancient knowledge inscribed on stone, hidden by the flood, eventually discovered and translated for later generations. This theme of recovered lost knowledge runs throughout Mesopotamian tradition. Temple archives claim to possess texts from before the flood, giving them ultimate authority and antiquity. Kings boasted of restoring buildings as they were in ancient days, implying earlier ages achieved perfection later generations could only imitate. The past appeared greater than the present, and each generation saw itself as living in the shadow of vanished glory. Perhaps this reflects the reality of Bronze Age collapse, the disruptions that periodically destroyed cities and scattered populations, forcing survivors to rebuild from fragments. Or perhaps it speaks to something deeper in human consciousness, the sense that something essential has been lost, that we're separated from a time when life made more sense, when purpose was clearer, when God still walked the earth and spoke in voices anyone could hear. The Anunnaki survived the flood, according to the texts, though their role afterward seems diminished. They remain as judges in the underworld, determining the fates of the dead, maintaining cosmic order from beneath rather than above. The great age of divine intervention passes, and what follows is the age of human struggle, human uncertainty, humans searching through old texts and broken tablets, trying to recover what the flood swept away. And yet the stars remain unchanged. The same celestial paths the antediluvian sages charted still wheel overhead, Venus rising as evening star before transforming to morning herald, the moon measuring months with reliable phases, the sun marking years through its movement along the horizon. If divine technologies once controlled these movements, they still function flawlessly. If gods once lived among us teaching astronomy and mathematics, their lessons survived in the careful observations recorded on clay tablets that would outlast the civilizations that produced them. What comes after catastrophe? Memory, preservation, interpretation, and the endless human effort to understand where we came from and what we've lost. Eridu sits in silence now, its mud brick walls dissolved back into the desert from which they rose. Located approximately 12 kilometers southwest of the ancient city of Ur, the site reveals itself today as low mounds barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. Yet excavations between 1946 and 1949 uncovered something remarkable: 18 successive building levels at the temple complex, showing continuous sacred occupation spanning more than 3,000 years. The lowest levels date to approximately 5,400 BCE, making Eridu one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in Mesopotamia. These earlier structures weren't grand, measuring roughly 3 by 4 meters, simple single-room buildings with altars or offering tables positioned against one wall. But each rebuilding phase expanded the sacred footprint, and by 4000 BCE, the temple covered more than 200 square meters, incorporating multiple rooms, courtyards, and elaborate decorative elements. Sumerian tradition called Eridu the First City, the place where kingship descended from heaven, and where the god Enki established his earthly residence above the Abzu. Archaeological reality supports at least part of this claim. Eridu does appear to be among the earliest permanent settlements in southern Mesopotamia, predating Uruk's rise to prominence by centuries. The consistency of temple architecture across millennia suggests remarkable cultural continuity, as if each generation rebuilt precisely where their ancestors had worshipped, maintaining connection to something they believed began at the very dawn of civilization. Fish bones appear in the earliest levels, reminders that this location once sat near marshland and coastline, though today it lies far inland from the Persian Gulf. Climate and geography shifted dramatically over the millennia, transforming landscapes and altering the relationship between cities and their environments. What the first inhabitants of Eridu saw when they looked toward the horizon would be unrecognizable to later Sumerian priests who served in the same sacred precinct. Nippur held different significance. Located roughly halfway between where the Tigris and Euphrates flow closest together, Nippur became the religious center of Sumer, despite never serving as a political capital. Enlil's temple, the Ekur, dominated the city's sacred quarter, and control of Nippur conferred legitimacy on Mesopotamian rulers for more than 2,000 years. Kings who couldn't claim Nippur's allegiance struggled to maintain authority elsewhere, suggesting the city functioned as a kind of neutral ground where divine sanction could be sought and granted. Excavations at Nippur beginning in 1889 produced staggering quantities of cuneiform tablets, more than 30,000 texts eventually recovered from temple archives and scribal schools. These included mathematical exercises, lexical lists teaching proper cuneiform usage, hymns to various deities, and administrative records tracking temple resources. The tablets reveal Nippur as a center of learning where scribes trained for years mastering the complex writing system, memorizing god lists and mythological narratives, preparing to serve in temples across the Sumerian world. The city's sacred geography followed precise patterns. The Ekur sat on an elevated platform, visible from kilometers away across the flat plain, establishing Enlil's temple as the axis around which everything else oriented. Streets radiated from this central complex, creating organizational structure that mirrored theological hierarchy. Lesser shrines dedicated to other deities occupied positions determined by their relationship to Enlil in the divine council, so that walking through Nippur meant moving through a physical representation of cosmic order. Uruk presents yet another model of sacred urbanism. This city, associated with Inanna and later with Gilgamesh, grew to extraordinary size by 3000 BCE, covering approximately 550 hectares and housing perhaps 50,000 inhabitants. The Inanna temple complex dedicated to Inanna sprawled across the city's center, rebuilt and expanded repeatedly, incorporating some of the earliest examples of monumental architecture in human history. The famous limestone Uruk vase, carved around 3200 BCE and standing nearly 1 meter tall, depicts the sacred marriage ritual central to Inanna's worship. Registers carved around the vessel show the natural world in the bottom tier, domesticated animals and agricultural products in the middle tier, and priests bearing offerings to the goddess in the top register. This visual narrative encodes theological understanding. Nature provides resources, humans organize and offer those resources, and gods receive worship in exchange for continued prosperity. What links these cities beyond their religious function? They appear to share astronomical orientations, temple alignments that track celestial events with precision, suggesting either sophisticated surveying knowledge or divine instruction depending on your interpretation. The Ekur at Nippur aligns to cardinal directions within half a degree of accuracy, remarkable considering the tools available to Bronze Age architects. This precision appears again at Uruk, at Ura, at Lagash, creating a pattern that seems deliberate rather than coincidental. Perhaps these alignments served practical purposes, tracking seasonal changes, essential for agricultural timing, marking important festivals, providing calendrical reference points, or perhaps they reflected belief that earthly structures should mirror celestial order, that temples needed proper orientation to function as meeting places between divine and human realms. The texts suggest both purposes mattered, that practical astronomy and sacred cosmology intertwined inseparably in Mesopotamian consciousness. Modern excavations using magnetometry and ground-penetrating radar reveal structures still buried beneath centuries of accumulated sediment. At approximately 70% of the ancient city remains unexcavated, hidden beneath soil and modern construction. What those buried buildings might contain, what texts, what artifacts, what evidence of daily life or ritual practice, remains unknown, waiting in darkness and stillness for future archaeologists to carefully uncover. Standing at these sites today feels like visiting monuments to memory itself, places where human ambition met geological time and lost decisively. The cities the Sumerians built to last forever dissolved within centuries of their abandonment, mud brick reverting to mud, walls to mounds, temples to anonymous hills. Yet enough survived, preserved by dry climate, or buried in favorable conditions, to give us fragmentary access to these ancient sacred landscapes and the astronomical knowledge encoded in their architecture. The Mul.Apian tablets preserve what may be humanity's oldest systematic star catalogue, compiled around 1000 BCE, but drawing on observational traditions stretching back centuries earlier. Written in Akkadian cuneiform across 2 tablets, they list 66 stars and constellations, organize them by their heliacal risings throughout the year, and provide instructions for creating accurate agricultural calendars based on celestial movements. Heliacal rising refers to the first visible appearance of a star or constellation just before sunrise after its period of invisibility, a phenomenon that shifts gradually throughout the year as Earth orbits the Sun. Ancient astronomers tracked these risings with impressive precision, noting that when certain stars appeared on the eastern horizon at dawn, specific seasonal events reliably followed. The Pleiades rising in spring signaled planting time. Sirius rising in summer warned of coming heat. These weren't superstitious associations, but empirical observations connecting celestial patterns to terrestrial cycles. The tablets also describe how to measure the length of daylight throughout the year using water clocks, devices that measured time by tracking the flow of water from one vessel to another. By comparing shadow lengths at noon across different seasons, Mesopotamian observers determined that the sun's position shifted along the horizon, reaching its northernmost point at summer solstice and southernmost at winter solstice. This knowledge enabled them to predict the changing length of days and nights with mathematical precision. Temple architecture incorporated this astronomical knowledge. The ziggurat at Ur, built around 2100 BCE by King Uru-Nammu, has corners aligned almost exactly to cardinal directions, north, south, and east-west, within approximately 0.5 degrees of accuracy. Achieving this alignment without magnetic compasses required careful observation, possibly by tracking the shadow cast by a vertical pole throughout a day to find true north, or by observing star movements and identifying the celestial pole. The ziggurat itself rose in 3 terraces, reaching approximately 30 meters in height, with each level slightly smaller than the one below, creating a stepped pyramid visible from vast distances across the flat Mesopotamian plain. Staircases on 3 sides led to the summit platform where a small temple stood, a space perhaps reserved for rituals performed under open sky with unobstructed views of the heavens. What happened on those summit platforms during the deep night hours, when stars blazed with intensity impossible to imagine under modern light pollution? The texts mention priests observing celestial omens, recording planetary movements, watching for eclipses and unusual phenomena that might signal divine messages. Venus receives particular attention in omen literature, her movements carefully tracked because she was Inanna, the goddess whose moods affected warfare, love, fertility, and political stability. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa, dating to around 1600 BCE, record 21 years of Venus observations, noting her appearances and disappearances, her periods as morning star and evening star, her synodic cycle that repeats approximately every 584 days. These records allowed priests to predict Venus's movements and schedule appropriate rituals, but they also reveal something deeper: sustained multi-generational observation programs that accumulated knowledge across centuries, refining predictions through patient record-keeping. Consider the precision this required. Venus disappears from visibility for periods ranging from a few days to several weeks when passing too close to the sun. Determining the exact day of her reappearance requires careful watching of the eastern or western horizon at twilight, looking for the first faint gleam against the brightening or fading sky. Miss that first appearance, and the whole sequence gets disrupted, throwing off subsequent predictions. Lunar eclipses could be predicted using the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years and 11 days after which eclipses repeat in similar patterns. The Mul.Apin tablets describe this cycle, enabling priests to anticipate when the moon would darken, when rituals should be performed to protect the king, when precautions were necessary against the evil omens that lunar eclipses supposedly brought. Whether they understood the physical mechanism, Earth's shadow falling across the moon, remains unclear from the texts, but their ability to predict the phenomenon was demonstrably accurate. Solar eclipses proved more challenging, their prediction requiring knowledge of the moon's varying distance from Earth and the geometry of the Earth-Moon-Sun system. Some scholars suggest Mesopotamian astronomers achieved this capability, while others argue their eclipse predictions remained probabilistic rather than certain. The evidence isn't conclusive, though reports of predicted solar eclipses appear in late Babylonian texts from the 1st millennium BCE. What if these astronomical capabilities exceeded what we typically attribute to Bronze Age cultures? Alternative researchers point to the precision of temple alignments, the mathematical sophistication of astronomical texts, and the multi-century observation programs as evidence that Mesopotamian knowledge approached or equaled modern understanding in certain domains. Mainstream scholars counter that impressive achievements don't require extraterrestrial intervention or lost super-civilizations, merely human intelligence applied systematically over generations. The debate sometimes focuses on the origin of this knowledge. Did it develop gradually through trial and error, observation and refinement, the patient accumulation of data across centuries, or did it arrive suddenly, taught by the Apakalu sages who brought civilization before the flood, divine knowledge transmitted to humanity from sources beyond earthly experience? The texts themselves suggest the second interpretation, crediting gods or antediluvian sages with introducing astronomy, mathematics, and temple architecture, but proving knowledge transmission from non-human sources requires extraordinary evidence, and the archaeological record shows gradual development rather than sudden appearance. Early temples are simpler than later ones. Early astronomical texts are less sophisticated than later compilations. The trajectory points toward human learning and improvement over time, not toward fully formed knowledge appearing without precedent. Yet mysteries remain. How did they achieve such precise cardinal alignments without instruments we consider essential? What techniques allowed them to measure the length of degrees with accuracy modern surveyors respect? Why do some alignments appear to track not just solar and lunar cycles, but also planetary positions or precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon requiring observations sustained across many centuries? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between human achievement and divine instruction, but in recognizing that ancient people possessed capabilities we've underestimated, that intelligence and persistence can accomplish remarkable things without requiring modern technology or supernatural intervention. The stars they watched still move along the same paths, their observations still valid, their mathematics still accurate. Whether gods taught them to read the heavens, or they learned through their own patient observation, the knowledge itself endures, preserved in clay tablets that survived millennia, to reach us across the vast silence of time. Small objects sometimes carry enormous meaning. Cylinder seals, carved stones, typically 2 to 4 centimeters tall and 1 to 2 centimeters in diameter, served primarily as identification markers in Mesopotamian commerce and administration, but they also preserved some of our most detailed visual evidence of ancient cosmology, mythology, and daily life. The seals functioned like signatures, made from materials including limestone, serpentine, lapis lazuli, and occasionally precious stones. They were carved with negative images, scenes or patterns cut into the stone's surface. When rolled across wet clay, they left positive impressions showing the carved design in relief. Merchants used seals to secure containers, temple administrators to validate documents, individuals to mark property. The seal's unique pattern identified its owner, making forgery difficult and establishing accountability in transactions. But beyond their practical function, these seals depicted theological narratives. Divine figures appear repeatedly, gods identified by horned crowns that marked their status, heroes wrestling lions or bulls, worship scenes showing humans presenting offerings to enthroned deities. The iconography follows conventions that remained stable for centuries, allowing us to identify specific gods even when no accompanying text names them. Inanna typically appears with her star symbol and lions, sometimes shown with wings suggesting her celestial nature as Venus. Shamash the sun god bears his saw symbol and solar disk, often depicted rising between 2 mountains representing the eastern horizon at dawn. Enki appears with flowing waters, representing his association with fresh water and the Abzu. The visual vocabulary encoded theological relationships that anyone familiar with the pantheon could instantly recognize. One seal in particular has generated intense debate, known as VA 243, currently housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. This seal shows several figures in worship posture, surrounding a seated deity, with star symbols scattered across the upper portion of the scene. Zechariah Sitchin argued in the 1970s that these star symbols represent a complete solar system, including planets unknown to ancient people, specifically a large sphere surrounded by 11 smaller spheres that he interpreted as the Sun with its orbiting planets, including the hypothetical planet Nibiru. Mainstream scholars reject this interpretation firmly. The so-called planets, they argue, are simply stars, a common decorative element in Mesopotamian glyptic art with no astronomical significance. The large sphere isn't necessarily the sun, but could represent any number of divine or symbolic elements. Similar star groupings appear on hundreds of other seals without implying planetary systems. Sitchin's reading, critics contend, projects modern astronomical knowledge onto ancient decorative art, seeing what he wanted to find rather than what the artisans actually intended. The debate reveals deeper tensions about how we interpret ancient evidence. Should we approach these artifacts assuming ancient people possessed only the knowledge we think they should have possessed based on our understanding of technological development, or should we remain open to possibilities that ancient knowledge exceeded our expectations, that they might have understood things we believe they couldn't have known? Assyriologists who study cylinder seals professionally note that thousands of these objects exist in museum collections and private hands, showing enormous variety in style, quality, and subject matter. Some depict elaborate mythological scenes requiring expert carving, while others show crude stick figures hastily cut into soft stone. The finest examples, carved in hard stones like lapis lazuli or carnelian, demonstrate remarkable artistic skill, with details rendered at scales barely visible to unaided eyes. Imagine holding one of these seals. The stone feels cool and smooth, polished from centuries of handling, weighing perhaps 15 to 30 grams, fitting comfortably in your palm. The carved surface shows minute details, individual fingers on divine figures, feathers on wings, scales on serpents. This level of precision required not just artistic talent, but also tools capable of cutting hard stone with control, copper or bronze drills, abrasive powders, steady hands, and patient hours bent over work that modern artisans using power tools would find challenging. The seals tell stories. Combat scenes show heroes wrestling supernatural creatures, possibly representing cosmic order imposed on chaotic forces. Banquet scenes depict gods seated at tables with food and drink, perhaps illustrating the daily feeding rituals performed in temples. Animal processions might represent the creatures preserved during the flood, or the diversity of creation under divine authority. Some seals show the Anunnaki explicitly identified by cuneiform inscriptions alongside the figures. These typically depict them as minor deities attending more important gods, standing in subordinate positions, sometimes shown in judgment scenes where they determine fates. The visual hierarchy matches the textual evidence. The Anunnaki occupy important but secondary positions in the divine bureaucracy, respected but not supreme. Beneath the carved images lies a hidden dimension we can only partially access. What did these scenes mean to the people who commissioned and carried these seals? Were they simply decorative choices, picking designs they found aesthetically pleasing? Or did the chosen imagery convey theological commitments, social status, or personal devotion to particular deities? The silence of these objects frustrates as much as it informs, showing us images without explaining the full context of their significance. Modern analysis techniques reveal details invisible to ancient observers. Microscopic examination shows tool marks indicating the cutting methods used. Chemical analysis identifies stone sources, tracing trade networks that brought lapis from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, and serpentine from local sources. Stylistic analysis dates seals to particular periods and regions, tracking how artistic conventions evolved and spread across Mesopotamia and beyond. Perhaps 100,000 cylinder seals survive in collections worldwide, with new examples still emerging from archaeological excavations and occasionally from illicit antiquities markets. Each one represents an individual, someone who commissioned this object, used it daily, carried it as personal property. That intimacy, the physical connection between ancient hand and modern hand, through an object that served both practical and symbolic functions, creates a strange immediacy. The seals remain, small cylinders of stone that outlasted the clay they impressed, the documents they secured, the hands that rolled them, the civilization that created them. They wait in museum cases and storage drawers, their carved surfaces still capable of making impressions just as crisp as when they were new, ancient technologies still perfectly functional after 4,000 years of patient silence. In 1976, Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, proposing that the Sumerian text should be read not as mythology, but as historical documentation of extraterrestrial contact. According to his interpretation, the Anunnaki were physical beings from a planet called Nibiru, following a 600-year elliptical orbit that periodically brings it near Earth. These beings came to our planet approximately 450,000 years ago, seeking gold, which they needed to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere. Finding the labor too demanding, they genetically engineered Homo sapiens by combining their own DNA with that of early hominids, creating a worker species to mine gold on their behalf. Sitchin's book sold millions of copies, translated into more than 25 languages, sparking a movement that continues today through television programs, documentaries, and ongoing alternative research. His appeal rests partly on the simple fact that the ancient texts do describe gods coming from the heavens, possessing advanced technologies, creating humanity through purposeful design, and witnessing catastrophic events like the flood. If we approach these narratives asking whether ancient people might have been recording actual events in the only vocabulary available to them, the possibility of extraterrestrial contact doesn't seem immediately absurd. His translation methods, however, drew harsh criticism from professional Assyriologists. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the 20th century's most respected Sumerian scholars, stated that Sitchin's knowledge of ancient Mesopotamian languages was inadequate at best. Specific errors in translation became points of particular contention. The word Anunnaki doesn't mean those who from heaven to earth came, as Sitchin claimed, but rather derives from offspring of An, or princely blood. The cuneiform symbols Sitchin identified as references to planets and astronomical events often carry different meanings in context, referring to gods, cities, or metaphorical concepts rather than celestial mechanics. Yet perhaps the linguistic critiques miss something important about why these ideas resonate so deeply with modern audiences. Alternative interpretations of ancient texts tap into genuine questions about human origins, the rapid development of civilization in Mesopotamia and other regions, and the apparent sophistication of ancient astronomical knowledge. When mainstream archaeology can't fully explain how certain monuments were constructed, how astronomical alignments were achieved without modern instruments, or why similar myths appear in widely separated cultures, The ancient astronaut hypothesis offers explanatory power that feels satisfying to many people. Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, published in 1968 before Sitchin's work, applied similar logic to multiple ancient cultures: the Nazca lines in Peru, the Moai statues on Easter Island, the pyramids of Egypt. Von Daniken argued these achievements required technological assistance from advanced beings. His books popularized the idea that humanity's leap from hunter-gatherers to city builders happened too quickly to be purely natural evolution, that something or someone intervened to accelerate our development. The appeal makes psychological sense. We live in an age of rapid technological change, aware that beings with sufficiently advanced technology would appear godlike to less developed civilizations. If we traveled back to ancient Sumer with our smartphones, aircraft, and medical knowledge, wouldn't the Sumerians record us as gods descending from heaven, projecting that scenario forward? The logic suggests that beings from more advanced civilizations might have visited Earth in deep antiquity, intervening in human development for their own purposes. Some researchers focus specifically on unexplained technical achievements. The precision of megalithic stonework at sites like Puma Punku in Bolivia, where andesite blocks were cut and fitted with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, challenges conventional understanding of Bronze Age capabilities. The sophisticated astronomical knowledge encoded in structures like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 9600 BCE, predates the supposed development of agriculture and permanent settlements, raising questions about the timeline of human cultural evolution. Alternative theorists also point to cross-cultural similarities in mythology. Flood narratives appear not just in Mesopotamia and Hebrew scripture, but also in ancient Greek, Hindu, Chinese, and indigenous American traditions. Stories of gods descending from the sky, mating with humans, and teaching civilization occur across unconnected cultures on different continents. Could these be independent inventions, or might they preserve fragmented memories of actual contact events that occurred worldwide? The mainstream academic response typically emphasizes that humans are fundamentally similar across cultures, facing similar environmental challenges, and developing similar explanatory narratives without requiring contact. Flood myths emerge because floods happen, catastrophic events that leave lasting impressions on cultural memory. Sky gods appear because the heavens dominate human experience, vast and mysterious, seeming to house whatever powers control weather, seasons, and cosmic order. Similar problems generate similar solutions. Similar questions yield similar answers, even among cultures separated by oceans and millennia. But what if we're too quick to dismiss possibilities that challenge our understanding of history? Archaeological paradigms shift periodically as new evidence emerges. Göbekli Tepe's discovery forced reconsideration of when humans developed complex religious architecture. DNA analysis revealed that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, rewriting the story of our evolution. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, once dismissed as fringe science, has gained credibility as evidence accumulates for a catastrophic event around 10,800 BCE that disrupted early civilizations. Perhaps the question isn't whether the Anunnaki were literally extraterrestrial beings, but rather whether we should remain open to possibilities that ancient people possessed knowledge or experienced events we can't fully reconstruct from surviving evidence. The texts preserve information, however filtered through cultural context and theological interpretation. Dismissing them entirely as mere mythology might discard genuine historical content along with the supernatural framework. Graham Hancock's work exploring potential lost civilizations focuses on this middle ground, suggesting that advanced human cultures might have existed before the end of the last ice age, achieving significant astronomical and architectural knowledge before being destroyed by cataclysms. Their survivors could have spread across the globe, bringing civilization-building knowledge to various regions, appearing as culture heroes or gods to less developed peoples. This hypothesis doesn't require extraterrestrial contact, but does challenge conventional archaeological chronology. We may never achieve certainty about what the Sumerian texts actually describe. The gap between their world and ours encompasses not just temporal distance but fundamentally different ways of understanding reality. They experience the sacred as immediately present, gods as active agents in daily events, the boundary between natural and supernatural as permeable. We tend toward materialist explanations, seeking physical causes for observable effects, uncomfortable with supernatural agency as historical explanation. Both approaches have limitations. Pure materialism sometimes dismisses too quickly what doesn't fit established paradigms. Pure belief in ancient astronauts sometimes accepts too readily what extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence to support. The truth, if we could access it, likely exists somewhere in the complex middle ground, ancient people recording real experiences through theological language, preserving genuine knowledge within mythological frameworks, describing what they witnessed using the conceptual tools available to them. The mystery persists because the evidence permits multiple interpretations, and perhaps that's not a failure, but simply the nature of working with fragmentary texts from vanished civilizations, trying to reconstruct not just their history but their consciousness, their ways of seeing and understanding the world they inhabited. Mainstream Assyriologists approach the Anunnaki texts as sophisticated mythology that reveals how Mesopotamian cultures understood cosmic order, divine hierarchy, and humanity's place in creation. This isn't dismissive reduction, but rather recognition that mythology serves profound functions, encoding cultural values, explaining natural phenomena, justifying social structures, and providing frameworks for meaning in a world that often appears chaotic and incomprehensible. The cosmology expressed in texts like the Enuma Elish reflects observable reality filtered through theological interpretation. Mesopotamians witnessed storms that could destroy crops and cities, floods that periodically devastated the land, celestial movements that followed predictable patterns, and the apparent stability of cosmic order despite periodic disruptions. Describing these phenomena as resulting from divine actions made perfect sense within their conceptual framework, just as we describe the same events through meteorology, hydrology, and astronomy within ours. Thorkel Jacobson, whose work in the mid-20th century established much of our understanding of Mesopotamian religion, argued that Sumerian theology represented a sophisticated attempt to understand how the universe functions. The divine bureaucracy, with its hierarchies and specialized functions, mirrored the earthly bureaucracies that administered Mesopotamian city-states. Gods governed cosmic departments, just as human administrators governed irrigation, taxation, trade, and justice. This wasn't primitive thinking, but rather systematic theology that organized complex observations into coherent explanatory systems. The creation of humanity from clay and divine blood encodes genuine insights about human nature. We are both earthly and possess something transcendent, both material and conscious, mortal yet capable of contemplating immortality. The Mesopotamian solution to this duality positioned humans as existing in dependent relationship with divine powers, obligated to serve through ritual and labor, yet also capable of wisdom, creativity, and moral choice. Whether we attribute these characteristics to literal divine creation or evolutionary development, the fundamental observation about human nature remains valid. Translation challenges complicate our understanding significantly. Sumerian and Akkadian don't map neatly onto English or other modern languages. The same word can carry multiple meanings depending on context. Grammatical structure differs fundamentally from Indo-European languages, and theological concepts sometimes lack direct equivalents in our vocabulary. When texts describe the me that Inanna steals from Enki, we struggle to find English words that capture what the Sumerians meant. Are they powers, principles, technologies, divine prerogatives, or something entirely foreign to our categories? Jeremy Black's work on Sumerian literature emphasized that we must resist the temptation to impose our expectations onto ancient texts. They weren't writing for us, weren't trying to preserve information for distant future generations, weren't concerned with the questions we bring to their words. They wrote within specific cultural contexts, addressing contemporary concerns, using literary conventions we can only partially reconstruct. Reading their texts as straightforward historical documentation ignores the complexity of how pre-modern cultures used narrative, how they distinguished different types of truth claims, and how they understood the relationship between myth and reality. Archaeological evidence generally supports gradual cultural development, rather than sudden technological transmission. Pottery styles evolve incrementally. Architectural techniques show clear progression from simple to complex. Writing emerges from accounting symbols and gradually expands to capture more abstract concepts. The trajectory points toward human innovation and accumulation of knowledge across generations, rather than fully formed civilization appearing without precedent. But archaeology also reveals surprises. The site of Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, dated to approximately 9600 BCE, features massive stone pillars, carved with sophisticated animal reliefs, arranged in circular structures, suggesting ritualistic purposes. This predates agriculture and permanent settlements in the region, challenging assumptions about the sequence of cultural development. Perhaps religious architecture and communal gathering preceded farming rather than emerging from it, suggesting the drive toward meaning-making and sacred space runs deeper in human consciousness than previously understood. DNA analysis of ancient human remains shows more complex population movements than earlier models suggested. People traveled vast distances, traded across enormous territories, exchanged ideas and technologies through networks that connected distant regions. The spread of metallurgy, pottery techniques, and agricultural practices occurred through these contact networks, not through independent invention in each location. This explains some cross-cultural similarities without requiring extraterrestrial intervention. Humans have always been mobile, curious, and prone to sharing knowledge. Scholars debate the relationship between Mesopotamian and Hebrew scriptures, particularly regarding flood narratives and creation accounts. The Genesis text shares obvious parallels with Mesopotamian sources, raising questions about cultural borrowing, common ancestral traditions, or independent development from similar conceptual foundations. Most academic consensus leans toward the Hebrews adapting Mesopotamian material, modifying it to fit monotheistic theology, though the mechanisms and timeline of this transmission remain subjects of active research. What about the impossibly long reigns in the Sumerian king list? Some researchers propose these represent not individual lifespans but dynastic periods, with each king actually referring to multiple generations ruling under a single name or title. Others suggest the numbers encode astronomical cycles or mathematical patterns, meaningful within Sumerian numerology. A few argue for chronological errors, suggesting scribes working centuries after the events misunderstood or inflated earlier records. We may never know the correct interpretation, but the numbers probably shouldn't be taken as literal lifespans without extraordinary supporting evidence. The Anunnaki themselves, in mainstream interpretation, represent one category within an elaborate divine bureaucracy that made sense of cosmic order through hierarchical organization. They judged the dead, witnessed divine councils, supported greater gods in their cosmic functions, and generally maintained the administrative machinery of reality. This wasn't primitive superstition, but sophisticated theological thinking that recognized different levels of divine power and different spheres of divine responsibility. Modern scholars also acknowledge that ancient Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge was genuinely impressive, achieved through patient multi-generational observation and mathematical analysis. They could predict lunar eclipses, track planetary movements, align temples to celestial events, and maintain accurate calendars. None of this requires alien intervention. It requires human intelligence, curiosity, and systematic record-keeping applied consistently over centuries. Perhaps the most important scholarly insight is that we should resist the false choice between primitive mythology and advanced alien contact. The Mesopotamian text represents sophisticated human attempts to understand reality, using the conceptual tools available within their cultural context. They observed accurately, thought systematically, created elaborate explanatory frameworks, and preserved their knowledge for future generations. Whether gods were real supernatural beings, personifications of natural forces, or misremembered technological encounters, may ultimately matter less than recognizing the texts as products of genuine human wisdom, grappling with profound questions about existence. We may never fully bridge the gap between their consciousness and ours, never completely understand what they believed about the Anunnaki, or what experiences generated those beliefs. The texts remain, baked clay preserving words from minds separated from us by vast gulfs of time and culture. We read them through our own assumptions, find in them our own concerns, and perhaps that's inevitable. The mystery persists, not because evidence is lacking, but because the evidence permits multiple readings, each revealing something true about both the ancient world and our relationship to it. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Maybe mystery serves essential functions, keeping us humble before the past, preventing premature certainty about things we can't fully know, and preserving space for wonder in an age that too often demands definitive answers. The Anunnaki wait in those ancient texts, neither fully revealed nor completely hidden, inviting each generation to encounter them anew and decide for themselves what these names carved in clay across 45 centuries of silence might actually mean. The Sumerian language died as a spoken tongue, sometime around 1800 BCE, replaced by Akkadian as the dominant language of Mesopotamia, yet the myth survived. Scribes continued copying the old stories, translating them from Sumerian into Akkadian, preserving narratives that by then were already ancient. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis epic, all existed in multiple versions across different periods and cities, each generation reinterpreting the material while maintaining core narrative elements. Babylonian scribes working under Hammurabi around 1750 BCE possessed texts describing events supposedly occurring thousands of years before the flood, creating a strange temporal layering where relatively recent scribes preserved supposedly ancient material that claimed to record primordial events. How much was original, how much was elaboration, and how much was invention? The question becomes nearly impossible to answer when dealing with oral traditions that existed for unknown periods before achieving written form. The Assyrians, rising to dominance in northern Mesopotamia during the first millennium BCE, inherited these Babylonian traditions and incorporated them into their own cultural identity. King Ashurbanipal, ruling from 668 to 627 BCE, assembled a library at Nineveh containing thousands of cuneiform tablets, including systematic copies of mythological, astronomical, and omen texts. His scribes worked from earlier sources, sometimes noting when tablets were damaged or texts uncertain, creating what amounts to the ancient world's most ambitious preservation project. When Nineveh fell to combined Median and Babylonian forces in 612 BCE, the royal library burned, and paradoxically that fire preserved it. Tablets that would have dissolved in rain or crumbled over centuries were instead baked hard by intense heat, creating accidentally permanent documents that survived burial for 400 years until British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard began excavations in 1849. The Hebrew Bible shows clear knowledge of Mesopotamian narratives, though transformed through monotheistic theology. Genesis describes creation, a garden in Eden, a great flood, and the Tower of Babel, all themes present in Mesopotamian sources, but reinterpreted to serve different theological purposes. Whether the Hebrews encountered these stories during the Babylonian exile after 586 BCE, through earlier cultural contact, or inherited them from common ancient Near Eastern traditions, remains debated, but the connections are undeniable. Greek and Roman writers had limited direct access to Mesopotamian texts, but they encountered Babylonian culture through conquest and trade. The historian Berosus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 BCE, composed a history of Babylon that transmitted Mesopotamian creation myths and king lists to Hellenistic audiences. Most of his work survives only in fragments quoted by later authors, but those fragments show Greek intellectuals engaging with Mesopotamian traditions, trying to reconcile them with their own mythologies and emerging historical consciousness. The gradual abandonment of cuneiform in favor of alphabetic scripts meant the old texts became unreadable. By approximately 100 CE, no one could decipher the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets thousands of years earlier. The libraries dissolved, the cities were buried by wind-blown sand and seasonal floods, and the Anunnaki vanished from human memory, except as dim echoes in religious texts that no longer remembered their Mesopotamian origins. For 1,700 years, the stories slept beneath the earth. Then, beginning in the 1840s, European archaeologists began digging in the mounds of Iraq and finding libraries buried beneath the ruins of forgotten palaces. The decipherment of cuneiform in the 1850s unlocked these texts, and suddenly ancient voices spoke again, describing gods and catastrophes and cosmic wars that predated anything in the Western canon. The Victorian world confronted evidence that civilization began in Mesopotamia, that writing originated there, and that the biblical narratives they considered sacred history had older parallels in pagan mythology. Even now, new tablets emerge from museum storage, unread since their excavation decades earlier. The British Museum holds approximately 130,000 cuneiform tablets, with only a fraction published or translated. Each year brings new editions of ancient texts, revised interpretations of familiar narratives, and occasionally genuine discoveries that change our understanding of Mesopotamian culture. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad contains thousands of tablets still awaiting scholarly attention, their contents unknown, their stories untold. Modern Iraq, despite decades of conflict and instability, continues producing archaeological discoveries. In 2019, excavations at the ancient city of Girsu uncovered administrative buildings with intact archives dating to approximately 2400 BCE, adding thousands of new documents to the corpus of Sumerian texts. These aren't mythological narratives, but economic records, yet they reveal how the temple systems actually functioned, providing context for understanding the theological texts that describe divine economics. Satellite imagery and remote sensing technologies allow archaeologists to identify buried structures without excavation, mapping entire ancient cities that remain underground. Ground-penetrating radar reveals temple complexes, residential areas, and fortification walls, showing urban planning at massive scales. Approximately 10,000 archaeological sites in Iraq alone await investigation, each potentially containing texts, artifacts, or architectural evidence that could refine or revise our understanding of Mesopotamian civilization. The stories fascinate us today for reasons beyond mere historical curiosity. They speak to fundamental questions about human origins, the relationship between creators and created beings, the role of catastrophe in shaping history, and whether we're alone in the universe or part of a larger cosmic community. The Anunnaki narratives touch on all these themes, presenting gods who are powerful but not omnipotent, wise but occasionally foolish, capable of creation and destruction, maintaining order through constant effort, rather than effortless perfection. Perhaps we see ourselves in these stories, our own struggles and limitations projected onto cosmic scales. The divine labor disputes that led to human creation mirror our own experiences with work, hierarchy, and exploitation. The floods that periodically reset civilization echo our anxiety about nuclear war, climate change, or any of the catastrophes we fear might erase everything we've built. The forbidden knowledge that certain gods preserve despite divine prohibition speaks to our own relationship with dangerous truths we can't unlearn. Still today, the same stars wheel overhead that Sumerian astronomers charted, following paths unchanged across millennia. Venus rises as evening star and morning star, cycling through her 584-day pattern just as she did when priests called her Inanna and tracked her movements to divine the will of the gods. The moon measures months through phases that Mesopotamian scribes calculated with mathematical precision. The sun marks seasons through solstices and equinoxes that temple alignments still record in stone and brick. We inherit this knowledge whether we recognize the inheritance or not. Our 7-day week derives from Mesopotamian association of days with celestial bodies and their divine patrons. Our division of circles into 360 degrees comes from Babylonian mathematics. Our astronomical terminology preserves ancient divine names: Jupiter and Venus, Mars and Mercury, Saturn and Neptune. The zodiac signs we casually reference in horoscopes began as Mesopotamian constellations, marking the sun's annual path. The legacy isn't just astronomical or mathematical. It's also about how we tell stories, how we grapple with questions of meaning and origin, how we preserve knowledge across generations, and how we remember what matters, despite the relentless erosion of time. The Sumerians chose to write down their myths when they first possessed that capability, recognizing that some truths deserved permanence, that some questions transcended individual lifetimes and required transmission to distant futures they would never see. And now you lie here in the darkness, listening to those voices speaking across 45 centuries, preserved in clay that outlasted empires and religions, and entire ways of understanding reality. The questions they asked remain our questions. The mysteries they confronted remain mysterious. The search for meaning they conducted through theology and astronomy, and careful observation of the world around them, continues in us, using different tools, but animated by the same fundamental human need to understand where we came from, why we're here, and what forces larger than ourselves might be shaping our existence. The story isn't finished. It continues in every person who looks up at the stars and wonders what lies beyond, in every archaeologist carefully excavating tablets from ancient ruins, in every scholar working to decipher what those tablets say, and in you, here, now, adding your own consciousness to the long chain of human minds that have contemplated the Anunnaki and tried to understand what those names carved in clay across such vast silence might actually mean. Let's return now to where you are. The room around you, quiet and dim, your breathing slow and natural, the weight of your body against whatever surface holds you, solid and present. The ancient voices we've been listening to have faded back into their clay tablets, back into museum storage and archaeological archives, back into the patient silence they maintained for millennia before we disturbed them with translation and interpretation. The stars are still there, if you could see them through your ceiling and the ambient light of the modern world. The same stars that Sumerian priests watched from ziggurat summits, tracking Venus as she moved between her roles as evening and morning star, noting the positions of planets against the background constellations, measuring time through celestial movements that continue unchanged. The Anunnaki, whether gods or myths or misremembered visitors or theological constructs, witness those same stellar patterns, and the stars remember nothing, reveal nothing, simply continue their ancient rotations as they have for billions of years before humanity existed, and will for billions more after we're gone. We've asked many questions tonight, offered various interpretations, presented competing theories about what those wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets actually describe. Some mysteries we've clarified, tracing how civilization emerged in Mesopotamia, how writing developed, how myths evolved and were preserved. Other mysteries remain exactly as mysterious as they were when we began. We don't know what the Anunnaki truly were, to the people who wrote their names. We can't recover the consciousness of Sumerian priests, or the intentions of the gods they served. We can only read the words they left behind, and acknowledge that reading isn't the same as understanding, that translation captures meaning but perhaps not truth. The ruins still stand in Iraq, low mounds barely rising above the desert floor, where once great cities sprawled across irrigated fields. Eridu, where civilization supposedly began. Nippur, where divine authority was granted. Uruk, where Gilgamesh ruled and Inanna danced. The mud brick has mostly dissolved back into earth, the temples reduced to foundation stones and scattered pottery shards, but something persists, the shape of the past pressed into the landscape, visible to those who know how to look, who understand that empty ground can hold memory as surely as inscribed tablets. Wind still moves across those ruins, carrying sand and silence, wearing down what little remains above ground, while simultaneously burying and preserving what lies beneath. Rain falls occasionally, rare but welcome, temporarily transforming the desert into something resembling the marshlands that once characterized the region. The Euphrates still flows, though in altered channels and diminished volume, connecting the present to the ancient past through the simple fact of continued existence, water following gravity, as it always has, carrying silt and memory toward the sea. Perhaps in another century, archaeologists will uncover tablets we haven't found yet, texts that clarify what we currently misunderstand or reveal stories we've never heard. Perhaps new technologies will let us read damaged tablets previously considered illegible, or locate buried libraries through methods we haven't yet invented. The past isn't finished revealing itself, and the Anunnaki may speak again through discoveries waiting in darkness and patience beneath the Iraqi soil. Or perhaps the mystery endures exactly as it is, neither solved nor abandoned, questions that each generation encounters and interprets according to their own needs and understandings. The clay tablets wait, baked hard by ancient fires or desert sun, their wedge-shaped marks as clear today as when styluses pressed them into wet clay 45 centuries ago. Somewhere in museum storage, in archaeological site houses, in private collections and university archives, those voices wait to speak again, to anyone willing to learn the language and listen to what they have to say about gods and wars, and the ending of ages, and the creation of humanity, and the great flood that swept over, and the mysterious beings called Anunnaki, who judged and witnessed, shaped the world according to purposes we can only partially comprehend through fragmentary texts and competing interpretations, and the patient effort to hear what the ancients were trying to tell us, across the vast silence of deep time. And the stars continue turning overhead, measuring eternities in their slow procession, unchanged and unchanging, watching as civilizations rise and fall, and are forgotten, and are remembered again, as questions are asked, and partially answered, and asked again by new voices, in new languages, as the search for meaning continues through generation after generation, each adding their own understanding to the long conversation that began when the first human looked up at the night sky and wondered what lay beyond, and continues still in the darkness where you rest now, breathing slowly, thoughts drifting, sleep approaching like a gentle tide.